Welcome to this tutorial on landing procedures in the Mirage F1, specifically those performed in instrument flight rules conditions. We will go over the basics of using radio navigation to locate airfields, the concept of the omnibearing in the Mirage F1, the application of the ILS or Instrument Landing System, the use of the autopilot and how it can significantly improve your IFR landings, and the various parameters you will need to monitor during landing. Hello fellow virtual aviators, we are back in the delirificent Mirage F1 and today we'll be looking at safely bringing this awesome aircraft down once again, but in instrument flight rules conditions. As you can see, the weather conditions in terms of visibility are pretty terrible. We have complete cloud cover and a ridiculous fog obscuring the view over the crystal South Atlantic, where we are going to try to land at RAF Mount Pleasant on the Falkland Islands. Obviously the crux of the matter is that we must position our aircraft so that we are lined up with the runway and manoeuvre it in such a way as to descend and touch down safely and accurately on said runway without necessarily having any visual cues from outside. Naturally, we will have to rely on our instruments to inform us of where we are and how the aircraft is performing, hence instrument flight rules. To limit ourselves in terms of our navigation instruments, we will be using the Mirage F1 CE today, but the IFR landing procedures we will go through in today's tutorial apply equally to the other F1 models. This is also an excellent opportunity to utilize the Mirage's fantastic autopilot suite. So we are going to start by being completely lost. We know we are in the South Atlantic close to the Falklands, but are not sure exactly where we are, and we certainly cannot see the islands. We do not have access to an inertial navigation system in the F1 CE, and GPS didn't exist when the Mirage F1 first took flight, so we will have to use good old-fashioned radio navigation to find Mount Pleasant. And we will also use the Mirage's ILS, or Instrument Landing System, to get us down safely. Now, because I've been a clever boy, I've made a note of the various navigation equipment located at RAF Mount Pleasant. We could use the VOR beacon to help find the airbase and achieve the same result, but in this example we will use the station's TACAN, or Tactical Air Navigation Equipment. Mount Pleasant operates on TACAN channel 59er X-ray. The TACAN panel in the Mirage F1 CE is located here on the right console. It consists of two knobs used to select the channel required, the left tuning the tens and hundreds, and the right tuning the units. Each has a subselector on an outer ring to select either the X-ray or Yankee channel, and to select the mode. Let's first set the TACAN channel for Mount Pleasant, 59er X-ray. The TACAN equipment is fairly standard and similar to that found in other aircraft. The modes on the right subselector are either off, REC, which stands for receive, which will give us bearing to the TACAN station, T/R, which stands for transmit receive, which gives us both bearing and range to the station, and A/A, or air to air, which is used for TACAN yardsticking. Let's set to transmit receive. On the Mirage F1 CE's IDN navigation indicator, we need to select a mode which will display the TACAN information. Let's select VT, which is a combined VOR and TACAN mode. If you are flying in the F1 EE, you should set the IDN to RNAV-N mode. We can now tell the location of the airbase using the needles and display. The large white triangle is displaying the bearing or azimuth to the TACAN station. The distance indicator is showing the range to the station in nautical miles. So we can see here that RAF Mount Pleasant is just over 107 nautical miles away at a bearing of 295 degrees. We can confirm we are tuned to the correct TACAN station by listening for its Morse identifier. Ensuring that the volume is turned up, we should be able to hear the code Mike Papa Alpha in Morse code repeated periodically for TACAN station 59er X-ray. Mike Papa Alpha confirmed. This is all well and good. However, if we are going to land the aircraft, it will do us no good to simply fly to the airbase using the information on the IDN. Yes, we would be over the airbase, but we would not be in a position to land the aircraft unless we could see it in order to fly a pattern approach. A better solution would be to fly to a final approach point which will line us up with the runway in preparation for descent. This point is some distance away from the runway along the runway's radial. Thankfully, we can find this point using the Mirage F1's omni-bearing controls. Omni-bearing is the term used in the Mirage F1 for a course or radial line anchored at and directed towards a particular reference point, such as a TACAN or VOR beacon. By setting an omni-bearing, we can ensure we approach that point from a chosen direction. Instruments in the cockpit will guide us towards the path inscribed by the omni-bearing line, rather than straight towards the reference point. Obviously, this is ideal for lining us up with a runway we cannot see. The omni-bearing is set here on the Navigation Aid control panel. As our primary navigation system is gyromagnetic, we should set this to the magnetic heading of the runway we wish to land at, in this case runway 28, which has a magnetic heading of 281 degrees. We want the omni-bearing to cue off the TACAN beacon in this case, so we will set the mode to TAC for TACAN. We are now presented with all the necessary information on our instruments to get lined up with the runway. The yellow needle on the spherical ADI is the course deviation line, indicating where we should steer in order to intercept the radial set as the omni-bearing, in this case steering to the right. Given that this is the opposite direction to the TACAN itself, we should eventually intercept the radial if we hold this course. The deviation line will drift towards the center, showing we are approaching the correct radial. Now we could fly the aircraft manually using the deviation line as a guide. However, when flying the F1, you should never be afraid to utilize the autopilot suite, and if the circumstances are correct, we can even get the autopilot to do the work for us here and automatically intercept the omni-bearing radial. We currently have the autopilot armed and set to altitude hold. If we also now depress the R or route curry switch, acquisition of the omni-bearing radial will be done for us. If the route switch shows 3 red lights, the route mode is switched on but is not currently steering the aircraft towards the omni-bearing course, most likely because it is too far away or our current heading is too far deviated from it. 2 red and 1 green lights indicates that interception of the omni-bearing has started. The autopilot is steering the aircraft onto the correct course. When the correct course is achieved, 1 green light will be displayed. Okay, we now have 1 green and 2 red lights on the autopilot route switch, and the yellow deviation line on the spherical ADI has started to move towards the center. The autopilot will now maintain this and turn us onto course so that the TACAN beacon is directly in front of us. We are getting close to achieving a good track on the Omni bearing, and we should see the autopilot route mode achieve acquisition. Oh, there we go. We've achieved the green light on the route switch. So this tells us the autopilot is now confident we will achieve the correct course. Notice that we are not yet on course, judging from the deviation line and the needle on the IDN, so just continue to monitor this and ensure both of these eventually normalize. The autopilot will continue to make adjustments so long as the route mode is armed. Occasionally we may notice that the aircraft sometimes oversteers slightly and puts us off course, but trust in the equipment, she will steer us back. Just make sure we have enough airspeed to do so at all times. Now that we are approaching the runway on the correct radial, we will get set up for our ILS approach. The ILS system on the ground at Mount Pleasant is essentially a highly directional radio beam that broadcasts along the radial of the runway and also provides us with the correct glide slope. We need the ILS equipment in our aircraft to detect it, so we must tune into it. Runway 28 has ILS equipment operating on 111.90 MHz. Tuning is done on the combined VOR/ILS panel, also located on the right console. Similar to the TACAN panel, it consists of two knobs used to select the frequency required, the left tuning the pre-decimal part of the frequency and the right the post-decimal part. Each has a subselector on an outer ring to select A or M, Arrit or Marsh, in other words on or off. HG and BD are test modes which are not used here. So let's tune the ILS frequency for Mount Pleasant runway 28 and switch the system on. The ILS system also has a Morse identifier associated with it, and this is to let the pilot know that the correct ILS equipment has been selected. So let's just reduce the volume of the TACAN signal and increase the volume of the VOR ILS signal. Our runway's identifier is India Mike Papa in Morse, so let's listen out for that. Signal identified. I like to have both signals sounding in my headset, so let's just readjust those volumes so we can hear both. Now, at the moment, no ILS localizer or glide slope information is being displayed on our instruments for two reasons. Firstly, we are too far away. We should pick up the signals about 10 to 15 nautical miles away from touchdown. And secondly, we are still taking our course deviation cues from the TACAN beacon, which we will continue to do so until we are much closer. So we will continue to be guided by the TACAN Omni bearing. However, we need to descend to prepare for landing. When 10 nautical miles away from the runway, we should aim to be about 3,000 feet AGL. My preference is to be slightly below this, say about 2,500 to 2,800 feet, just to make sure that we intercept the glide slope signal. To ensure that we are measuring this correctly, we need to calibrate our slaved altimeter. Now, we could use QNH and our knowledge of the altitude of the airfield. However, we will use QFE as this is provided to us by air traffic control and shows the height above the field itself on our gauges. So with our radio tuned, let's contact the tower. 29.66 inches of mercury is approximately 1004 millibars, so let's just tune that. This is our height above the runway and slaves our altimeter ribbon on the sight head. Very useful for landing. We are still very far out, over 70 nautical miles, but for the purposes of today we will now descend to our target altitude. We want to keep autopilot route mode on to keep us on course, so we are only going to disengage the altitude hold. We'll then set an attitude for descent, monitoring this using our altimeter and vertical speed indicator, and then rearm altitude hold when we reach just under 3,000 feet AGL. We are approaching our target altitude. So as stated before, I prefer just below 3,000 feet. Let's say about there. We'll rearm altitude hold. We'll see our vertical speed indicator normalize, and then it is best practice to then smoke over the gauges again and make sure our course remains correct. Okay, we are just over 20 miles away from the TACAN beacon at Mount Pleasant, on the correct course of the runway radial, and just under 3,000 feet based on QFE. We still can't see a thing, but we very soon will be switching over our navigation aid to the ILS, and we will try to detect the signal beams for the localizer and glide slope. Again, we will be using the awesome autopilot to do most of the hard work, and we will ride the beams to touchdown. First, let's switch on approach mode and the associated symbology on the sighthead. We'll also reduce the brightness of the gunsight pipper to 0 as we do not need it. We already have our landing and external lights prepped. Between 15 and 20 nautical miles, we will switch over our omnibearing cue to VOR/ILS on the nav aid panel. Now this will automatically cancel the route function of the autopilot, and the yellow course deviation line on the spherical ADI is now referring to the localizer. It is also normal for the deviation line to be slightly off-center when we do this, and this is because we are now taking our cues from the ILS beacon rather than the TACAN, and the TACAN is not actually in line with the runway, it is simply close to it. So let's rearm the route function of the autopilot by pressing the R Corrie switch to keep us on course. And straight away we are being steered back onto the localizer. We will also arm the glide slope autopilot by pressing the G or glide slope Corrie switch. When the glide slope autopilot is armed, 3 red lights will be illuminated. 1 red light indicates that the glide slope has been detected. 1 green light indicates that interception of the glide slope has started and/or has been achieved. We haven't yet detected the glide slope. This typically happens between 8 to 15 nautical miles out. We will know when we have detected it as another steering cue will appear. There we go, detected at 14 nautical miles out. The horizontal yellow line on the spherical ADI is our glide slope deviation line. And very soon the autopilot should synchronize with this and begin to intercept it. No more jump cuts or fade outs from now on, so we can see the full final approach. I expect the glide slope to be detected very soon by the autopilot. There we go, autopilot is beginning to synchronize and we're about 10 nautical miles out, so we'll get configured for landing. By 10 miles out we want to have reduced our speed to below 240 knots, so we can now deploy our flaps, followed by our landing gear at around about 210 knots. We are looking good. One green light indicates that we now have the glide slope captured by the autopilot, which automatically disengages altitude hold and starts our descent. With the autopilot doing most of the heavy lifting, all we need to do is adjust the throttle to keep us on speed with an angle of attack between 9 and 11 degrees. We don't need to do any trimming as the autopilot will handle that for us. Now I still can't see the runway, it's out there somewhere. But everything's looking good. The two deviation lines on the spherical ADI have lined up. Everything's looking good, angle of attack is looking good. I still can't see the runway. This weather is ridiculously gratuitous, it is outrageous. 2,000 feet with 7 miles to go. Reiver's getting excited, ladies and gentlemen. We are speeding up slightly, so let's just reduce that throttle to bring our angle of attack back up to around about 10 degrees. There it is, there it is. Oh my god, I love this aircraft. I'm not sure if you can see it, ladies and gents, but it's right in front of us. In the words of Pete Conrad during Apollo 12, son of a gun, it's right down the middle of the road. Absolutely awesome, from completely lost to perfectly lined up. Outstanding. Everything's looking great. 1,500 feet at 5 miles to go. Of course, we could fly this approach without the autopilot by maneuvering the aircraft to follow the steering cues on the spherical ADI, but please make use of the autopilot. People from where I am from would say it is champion. ILS never fails to amaze me. Hopefully you can see the runway on the screen, folks. The lights are very faint in this ridiculous fog, but we're nearly there. Now the autopilot won't land the plane for us, so we're going to disengage it at around about 200 feet above the runway. Because we have correctly set our slaved altimeter, we can monitor our altitude above the ground using the altitude ribbon on the sight head, which we will do. So we will look out for 200 feet. We will then disengage the autopilot and fly the last section of the landing ourselves. Looking good, 500 feet to go, everything's looking fantastic. So looking out for 200 feet, we'll adjust the throttle again because our angle of attack is chasing downwards. "200 feet, let's disengage the autopilot, and at 50 feet we will flare as normal and hopefully we will touch down without too much of a bump. Flare. Bumpy, but any landing you can walk away from is a good landing, so let's do our normal braking procedures. We'll deploy the chute, etc., and bring her to her halt. Well, I'm happy with that. Home safely, and it's time for a cup of tea and a change of underwear. Well, as ever, I hope that was useful for you and has given you some hints and tips for IFR landing. Crank up the completely over-the-top weather conditions and let me know how you get on in bringing this awesome aircraft safely back home. If you're wondering, delirifacient describes something that causes delirium. With heartfelt gratitude to my patrons, especially Yan11, Lakota21, and our new Reiver Wizzo, the one and only Plabs. And also introducing our latest supporter, Rogue RN. Your support will always be thankfully received and faithfully applied. Feel free to do the usual thing, like, subscribe, comment and share, but until next time, virtual aviators, keep on rocking, keep on flying. This is Reiver saying last call.